Good morning. I am N.Y. Nithari, the Executive Director of the Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community Incorporated, and it is our organization which is the annual sponsor of the Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities. Today, it gives me a great deal of pleasure and pride to welcome you to this second Afrofuturism conference, Afrofuturism, What is Its Sound? I'm also particularly proud to acknowledge the University of Central Florida, the College of Arts and Humanities, as the major sponsor of this conference. The partnership with UCF ranges over 3 decades, and with the leadership of Dean Jeffrey Moore, the College of Arts and Humanities, and the Executive Associate Dean, Mr. Lyman, Brodie, we are able to bring to the public square what we are looking at as cutting-edge humanities. Under the leadership of our academics chair, Dr. Scot French, and the cycle curator, Dr. Julian M. Chambliss, we believe that this second conference will set the stage for a thorough exploration of the topic. We want to thank all of you for your participation, want to acknowledge the Orange County government through the Program of Arts and Cultural Affairs for its support, as well as the Orlando Utilities Commission and the Town of Eatonville Community Redevelopment Agency. Again, thank you for your participation.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to the ZORA Conference of 2021, titled Afrofuturism, What is Its Sound? My name is Bruce Janz, and I'm the co-director, along with Mark Kamrath, of the Center for Humanities and Digital Research at UCF. We're a center within the College of Arts and Humanities that focuses on digital humanities while engaging all forms of humanities research, digital or not. We've been involved in many projects in the history of Central Florida and beyond. We work with faculty, grad students, and undergrads, and partner with groups both inside and outside of universities in Florida and across the country and even beyond. We are proud to be sponsors and supporters of this conference. We've been involved with the Zora Festival for years now and have been so pleased and impressed with the way it's grown and developed over that time. The superb leadership has had the vision to turn this conference into everything that made Zora Neale Hurston special: her keen insight into Black life, her academic and anthropological rigor, her incisive writing, and the artistic ability she showed in her plays. Even though the coronavirus changes what is possible in a conference, a stellar lineup of speakers and topics has been assembled here. And so thank you so much for being part of this conference. And I think you're going to find that it is an invigorating and exciting set of ideas and people. And I hope you have as good a time as we have had at past conferences, and I hope to have at this one as well. So thanks for being here, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lyman Brodie. I'm an Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Humanities, and I want to welcome you on behalf of Dean Jeffrey Moore and the College of Arts and Humanities. And I want to thank my colleagues for their welcome words already. And it's really exciting for all of us to be here in the second annual version of Afrofuturism. Last year's conference was entirely exciting and a wonderful experience for all of us. And I'm looking forward to this year's conference as well. It's really interesting during these COVID times, especially to have, the mix of the virtual presentations. And I think you can see a few of us are actually here in person. So this is going to be a wonderful 2 days. And I want to thank all of you that are near and far for participating in this year's conference. And welcome to UCF.
Good morning. My name is Scot French, and I'm an associate professor of history and director of public history at the University of Central Florida. I'm also the chair of the ZORA Festival Academics Committee, which meets throughout the year to organize this conference. And I'd like to start by acknowledging my fellow committee members who put countless hours into this kind of work and really, really make it go. The members include Julian Chambliss, Dr. Julian Chambliss. You'll be seeing a lot of him this weekend. I'm going to say a few more words about him later. He's professor of English and Val Berryman Curator of History at Michigan State University. Anna Lilius, professor of English at the University of Central Florida. Trent Tomengo, professor of Humanities at Seminole State University. Trent is behind me. You can see him. He'll be facilitating here in this room. Clarissa West White, reference librarian and instructor at Bethune-Cookman University. She'll be facilitating, moderating a session tomorrow. Jason Gregory, a lecturer in the film department at the University of Central Florida. And I want to give special thanks to Michelle Robinson, professor of English at Spelman University, for her assistance throughout the year. Let me also thank the production support team in the UCF History Department who are here in the room with me right now, and we have several online as well. They work hard behind the scenes, off camera, to make all of this possible. We have Tiffany Rivera. Tiffany's behind me. There's Tiffany. Tiffany does it all. She is the program coordinator for the History Department and is really leading this production program team. Holly Baker is not here with us today, but she does podcasting and conducts interviews that are part of the larger festival academics conference, and you'll hear her voice in those podcasts that we'll be talking about a little bit later. Kayla Campana, program support. She's here with, oh no, she's not, she's online. She's a graduate student in history. Anna Kephart is here with us, public history GRA, and a digital librarian, and she has worked a lot on the syllabus that goes with this conference. And Rihanna O'Neill, a public history graduate student as well. So that's our team, our history department team. I'd just like to say a few words about the format here. A year ago, as we started planning for 2021, we knew things were going to be different and that we couldn't count on a traditional face-to-face meetup in 2021. We could not count on that. And so we began reimagining this conference as a hybrid event with both a live stream webinar and a limited seating discussion. And at first we imagined that the panelists would be joining us here in this space, but as it turns out, the panelists will be online and the live audience, limited seating audience, will be here in this room. So we're going to integrate both of those. We also began imagining the conference as the centerpiece for a year-round Afrofuturism syllabus and open educational resource that would be open and freely available to everyone. And that syllabus launched in November. And we invite you to check it out via the link on the ZORA Festival website. You could probably Google it, UCF Afrofuturism syllabus, but you can definitely find the link on the ZORA Festival website. And finally, we created a 1-credit special topics online course, Afrofuturism and the Hurston Legacy, which is open to all UCF students. And over the next 2 days, students from that course will be watching and participating in the chat along with you. So I'd like to welcome all of them, and we're very excited to have them be part of this. So let me tell you now a little bit about how this morning's session and all of the sessions in this 2-day conference will work. We'll have session moderators, myself, Julian Chambliss, and Clarissa West White, introducing each speaker. We'll have then, after the introductions, we'll have the keynote speakers present, and then we'll take questions here in this room, and Trent Tomengo will be facilitating that discussion. We'll also take questions from you in the chat window, so we really hope that you will participate actively and be part of this conversation. This morning's session will run until about noon, and then we'll have a lunch break and we'll reconvene at 1:30 with the second session, the second keynote presenter. If you miss a session and want to rewatch it, don't worry. We'll be posting them later on the Afrofuturism syllabus, and we can keep you posted on that via the registration email that you gave us. So now, I'd like to turn things over to Afrofuturism Cycle and Conference Curator, Dr. Julian Chambliss, who is the visionary and the intellectual force driving this 5-year thematic exploration. Julian is a professor of English and the Val Berryman Curator of History at Michigan State. He holds a joint appointment in the Department of History and as core faculty in the Consortium for Critical Diversity in a Digital Age Research, or CEDAR. He serves as a national planner for the Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities, and with Holly Baker, produces the award-winning festival-inspired podcast, Every Tongue Got to Confess. You know him, you love him, you follow him on Twitter. It's all yours, Julian.
Thank you, Scott. That was, I don't know if people love me, but I really appreciate that. I'm really happy, of course, to once again be engaged with the Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities. And as someone who previously lived and worked in Central Florida, really missed the opportunity for the physical conference. And I hope that we'll be able to get back to that again. Of course, we come together this year in troubling times. And I would be remiss if I ignored the weight of the challenges that we all have been facing, both individually and as communities and as a nation. Troubles of the pandemic, our faith in democracy challenged, and an uncertainty about when or if things will return to quote unquote normal drive many of our concerns right now. It's with this in mind, however, that I think it's great for us to take stock of the opportunities represented by the festival's engagement with Afrofuturism. Like many scholars and academics who think about Afrofuturism, I realize that current events are not new in the landscape of the Black imagination and history. While that old saying about history repeating itself can be overused, the point that Black communities have long been aware of uneven treatment under the law, lack of resources addressing pressing social issues, and fear of extra legal violence are facts, not hyperbole. Thus, the ZORA Festival's focus on Afrofuturism is timely and offers a way for us to think about the nature of our society and the nature of the troubles that we face in a new way. Last year, at the beginning of this cycle, we asked the question, what is Afrofuturism? And seeking to answer that question, we turned to scholars and creatives who provide us with a framework to understand traditions inherent to the Black experience that, while we call today Afrofuturism, really point to a longer legacy of a Black speculative practice. Last year, scholars like Ronaldo Anderson, Isaiah Lavender, Kenitra Brooks, and others offered us a way to think about a literary legacy connected to the African American experience, science fiction, and the speculative, and how that connected to a broader narrative of liberation. In doing so, I think they remind us of how Black people have always turned to speculative practice as a way to navigate the troubled waters that they may be facing. Now, those practices have become, at some level, normalized, or at the very least, they become very visible in the broader mainstream public. Afrofuturism is a term celebrated at some level by many people, but the question of what it is still in many ways unclear. Thus, our engagement with Afrofuturism in a sort of systematic way, asking these questions and then programming at some level the answers, is an attempt to reconcile this longer tradition associated with Black speculative practice, the contemporary activism and transformative practice that we see around us. An emphasis on Black thought and action and the contribution of Black cultural production to our understanding of modernity are at the core of Afrofuturism. If we think about Zora Neale Hurston, then she too stands out as a unifying figure, touching on the past and projecting some of her practices into our future narratives. Hurston's work can be seen through the Afrofuturist framework. She is recognized as an Afrofuturist. She thought about the subject position of Black people. She thought about the ways that Black people cultural production added to and helped define modernity. If we think about Zora Neale Hurston as a model, her model is one that resonates very strongly and helps define what we understand to be Afrofuturism. As a Black innovator of the past, she is at some level celebrated, but the nature and depth of that celebration should be emphasized and amplified by our consideration of Afrofuturism. As we turn this year to a consideration of sound in the second year of our cycle, we look to scholars who are inspired by Hurston's work, but who are, of course, thinking about the legacy of sound in Black history and diasporic culture. Sound is another way to document the intersections between speculation and liberation at the core of Black speculative practice. And thinking about this approach, we brought together a dynamic group of scholars to map this terrain. I can think of no better way to start than with Erik Steinskog. Erik is an associate professor of musicology at the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. He received his doctorate in musicology from Norwegian University of Science and Technology with a dissertation exploring opera. He published the book Afrofuturism and Black Sound Studies, Culture, Technology, and Things to Come in 2018. And his current research engages with questions of African-American music and science fiction, music as a cultural and political force, and music related to questions of race, gender, and sexuality. As a scholar of Afrofuturism and sound, Erik is one of the people who has most strongly helped to define the unique intersections between Black cultural practice and sound. And it's my great honor to have him here at the Zora Neale Hurston Festival and to have you hear some of his insightful research about Afrofuturism. Erik?
Thank you very much. And I first want to take the opportunity to thank Professor Chambliss and the Zora Neale Hurston Festival for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. It's only too bad that I have to be 4,700 miles away and in a different time zone. I would have loved to engage in direct conversation with the other speakers and the audience. But here I am. It's about sunset for me, and I hope the lighting over here will work for the Zoom transmission. As already mentioned, I'm a musicologist at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark, and this is important for me to underline as well, because it says something from where I speak. The Scandinavian or European context is important in its own right, but also my scholarly home influence my take on Afrofuturism and its sounds. Speaking about sounds and music from a musicological point, that is likely different than from the point of view of literary studies or urban geography. That said, in my work, I try to be interdisciplinary. I try to learn from lots of disciplines, as in general, most musicologists seem to do. And so I hope that my talk will communicate with audiences outside of my disciplinary home as well. I'm trained primarily as a music historian, but in relation also to so-called popular music, as well as European classical music. But this training includes contextual readings of the music in dialogue with cultural studies and a number of other disciplines. What I do want to do today is, in this talk, is to offer some thoughts on the meaning of sounds. I will particularly focus on musical sounds, but some of what I'll be speaking about will also be of consequence to our more general sonic surroundings. I don't think my talk will be particularly speculative, but my aim is to say something about the relation between speculation and sounds, and how one can speculate around sounds, but arguably also in sounds. I will do this by focusing on three dimensions that I think are strongly related, what I in my subtitle have called oral history, sonic fiction, and Afrofuturism, respectively. It is often said that one difference between images and sounds is that we can close our eyes, thus avoid seeing. Close our eyelids, thus avoid seeing, but we don't have any earlids. And thus sounds are always there. How much we focus on the sounds, on the other hand, is a different question, also related to the distinction between hearing and listening, where the latter is understood as a much more concentrated act. And thus, linguistically, we could almost propose that the missing earlids, so to speak, in this particular sense, is the difference between hearing and listening, and thus understood in relation to attention rather than absence. It also seems safe to say that some people are more attentive to sounds than others, and this includes musical sounds. So-called background music is in a sense not made to be listened to. It simply exists in the background and as some kind of aural wallpaper. But it is still obviously possible to listen to background music as well, as it is possible to become more attentive or more attuned, to use a musical metaphor, to background noise, our sonic surroundings, or simply to all the sounds being a part of our everyday life. What I have just described in relation to sound and music is, however, at the same time also related to the here and now, to sounds and music being heard or listened to as they are produced. It is a truism that sounds and music in a sense disappears, that it lingers and then disappears only to exist in our memory. In the tradition of European music, the history of so-called classical music, or the music formerly known as classical, one solution to this is to write the music down in musical notation as a way of storing the sounds in a different medium, so as to repeat them at a later occasion. Other musical traditions solved the problem of the disappearing music by singing the same songs or playing the same music again and again, passing it down in history from generation to generation, and thus the same music is kept alive, not really disappearing, and becomes both tradition, archive, and history. The history of European music has claimed that the written notation were much more exact than oral transmissions, thus established hierarchies among different kinds of music. This thought of hierarchies seems to have been long-lived, and I think one can find elements of it still today. Thus, in the overall discipline where I teach, much of the scholarly material I've been exposed to since I began as a student has clearly put European concert music, the notated music, on top of a hierarchy of values. Though in parallel, as a counter-history and counter-tradition, all other kinds of music is also discussed, and internal discussions in the discipline are strong to these days. In the late 19th century, an important invention changed the premises of this hierarchy. And while this might seem like a detour in my talk, it is of importance for my argument. The invention and development of the gramophone and phonograph made it possible to store sounds, playing them back at a later time than when they were recorded. This is a different story than the notated music, as in the phonograph, the sounds become a kind of writing in the grooves of the record, which could be read by the stylus and thus become sounds again. This relation between sound and writing resembles both the written transmission of notated music and the oral transmission of music between musicians. The latter is made clear since the invention of the phonograph by all aspiring musicians that have been sitting in front of a phonograph trying to copy the music they heard on their own instruments by playing the discs on repeat. Storing sounds on gramophone records also had and have huge consequences for how music could be transported, and over much bigger distances than traveling musicians, for example, as well as our understandings of history and the past. It became, in a radical sense, possible to listen to history, to listen to something in the past, in the present. Thus, the disappearance of music in the old and probably kind of Eurocentric understanding is no longer an issue, or at least no longer the same issue. As long as the technological equipment to read the old inscriptions are there, that is, as long as you have a gramophone player, those old records can be heard. There is an archive of sounds, sonic material, as well as music. The gramophone was not only used for playing music for entertainment, although throughout the ages that has obviously been an important use as well. The gramophone also became a tool for scholars, folklorists, ethnologists, and anthropologists in recording so-called oral traditions. Like the fieldwork Zora Neale Hurston did together with Alan Lomax and Mary Elizabeth Barnacle in the summer of 1935 in Georgia and Florida, researching African-American song traditions. Given that the oral transmission of music through generations more often than not was within a community, these recordings also meant that in addition to the scholarly preservation of music in archives or museums, the possibility of listeners outside of musical communities also could get access to the songs. It goes without saying that the fact of recordings of African American music is a necessary condition for me being able to do my work. It is due to the recordings that I have access to, that the music I write about, and it is primarily through these recordings that I have gained some kind of understanding of this music. This, however, also comes with another dimension, one that I am obviously aware of and one that cannot really be taken away. I am an outsider to the community and traditions I write about. Thus, in addition to listening to the music, I obviously read to gain more knowledge about the context of the musical sounds, to learn about history, culture, dance, everyday life, and so on, but obviously always at least once removed. I can only, I guess, hope that my listening takes place in a context where, through empathy and understanding, I can get some of the music's meaning. With the gramophone then, it became possible to write another kind of story about the sounds of the past. It still needs to be written, but the material one writes about became accessible in a radically different sense. Thus, what I, in my subtitle, refer to as oral history can be understood in two different modes before and after the invention and spread of the gramophone. It also means that access to these historical sounds became easier for these sounds to travel. As Paul Gilroy has shown in his book, The Black Atlantic, the traveling or movement of recorded music is also part of another history of modernity, a history where Black music and the globalization of Black music takes place. Sorry. I am not, however, claiming that oral history is dependent upon the gramophone. While sounds and music of the past may have disappeared, at least in the exact sense of the sounds being heard, obviously music and sounds is an important part of history throughout the ages. Writing about sounds from what could be called the pre-gramophonic era just has some other challenges than if the phonograms are the empirical material. But the oral transmissions of sounds through generations is clearly one of the traditions that should be taken seriously here. As already said, such traditions of oral transmission is a highly important archive, not only for folklorists and anthropologists, but also in oral history in communities across the globe, historically and today. It seems though, that it took some time for university scholars, at least in my part of the globe and in my discipline, to appreciate this importance. In Alondra Nelson's text, Future Texts, her introduction to the journal's social text special issue on Afrofuturism back in 2002, she writes, Afrofuturism can be broadly defined as African-American voices with other stories to tell about culture, technology, and things to come, unquote. There are several dimensions in this definition, ever so broadly, that are of interest to me. The first one is the quote-unquote other stories. In my mother tongue, Norwegian, we use the same word for story and history. We still distinguish between the two senses of the word, and depending on context, I guess we normally manage to hear whether the word historia signifies story or history. But using the same word opens up some possibilities for thinking. One could say that it problematized the difference between fact and fiction. In other words, that history is a record of facts, whereas stories are myths, tales, and narratives. Another possibility is to say that the word indicates that we also tell the story of history, that there is a framing, a use of literary techniques also when presenting history. Yet another possibility, however, is to ask about any hierarchy and relation between stories and histories. The African American voices with other stories to tell stories that are as true as the so-called history, but is other or different due to traditions, positions, communities, as well as the long history of suppression and the political dimensions determining whose stories became dominating or accepted as the history with a capital H. The other stories about culture, technology, and things to come are thus crucial for Nelson's future texts, but are clearly also related to the past. It is, as I think, a key dimension of Afrofuturist thinking, not solely or exclusively about the future. It is also about interrogating the past, having a space to tell the stories of the past, letting the past inform the present as well as the future. The future is still there in the definition of Nelson, things as things to come. And Nelson continues her definition by referencing, quote, sci-fi imagery, futurist themes, and technological innovations in the African diaspora, unquote. But this meeting of different historical layers intrigues me, for reasons also having to do with music and sound. When we at this event discuss Afrofuturism, what is its sound? An additional question for me in my work on sound and music is how to think about what we could call the sounds of the future. When I earlier discussed the gramophone as making the past resound, making it possible to listen to history and historical material, it may have sounded trivial. But it becomes different, for me at least, when I'm trying to understand not only what the sounds of the future may be, or obviously how they would sound, but also how musicians and composers have been thinking about these sounds. Many of the musicians and composers now discussed under the umbrella term Afrofuturism, and I call it an umbrella term here because there's so many different kinds of music that even using the term Afrofuturism to discuss them all might actually need a more precise definition of different practices, and so we need more terms than Afrofuturism as this umbrella term. But anyway, but many of the musicians discussed under the term Afrofuturism have attempted to make music that should sound futuristic, trying, that is, in the here and now, to give sound to something that haven't happened yet, trying to use music as a medium through which we can glimpse the future, almost as if music had some prophetic possibility. Thinking about the sound of the future may be one place to introduce the concept of the speculative. Nelson's definition of Afrofuturism also samples from Mark Derry's definition, where in addition to other stories to tell, he also highlights speculative fiction, or as Julian just talked about, speculative practices. That speculative fiction is important within Afrofuturism seems clear, and one could say that speculative fiction is yet another layer in the discussion of other stories. I said above that stories could be myths, thus hinting at the difference between myth and history, and thus also any thought of mythology as being so-called prehistorical. Such a thought thus claims that history in this particular sense has a beginning, sometimes called the beginning of quote-unquote recorded history. Here then again is one place where records, often understood as writing, becomes key, and where the other stories seemingly disappears or become less important. Reading historical artifacts and traces can expand on the recorded, thus blur the distinction between history and mythology. And the long lives of myths being retold through generations obviously are important as well and should not be reduced to just old tales. But one use of the term speculative is stories that are less founded in recording history, as if the storyteller is adding layers to fragments, making the tale richer. I'm saying this also to state that speculative fiction can be about the past, can be alternative historical tales, use counter-historical or anachronistic dimensions, and so on. Much speculative fiction, however, is about the future in one sense or another. But without digressing more, and while acknowledging the importance of storytelling in Afrofuturism, for me this also points to a challenge. Much of the aesthetic endeavor of Afrofuturism has been in the domain of music, and sounds work differently than words or images when it comes to telling stories. There is, I would claim, a resistance in the sonic, a resistance of the sonic to become part of stories or narratives. This does not mean that music or sounds are without meaning. Sounds definitely make sense and takes part in meaning making, but they do so differently than words or images. To me, this is not even because music or sounds lack a semantic layer, as has often been said. And it's both because meaning and semantics are not the same, and because it is not quite established that music lacks semantic in anything but the most superficial sense. There is an additional resistance, for me at least, of music to speculative fiction. The term speculative comes from Latin speculatio, which is related to the sense of vision. It is not easy to find an oral alternative. It is the same with the term imagination that we also often use, which is closely related to image and the visual. And what I, as a musicologist, am occupied with is what kind of language we use to theorize the material we discuss. How to find metaphors that are related to the sonic rather than the visual. An example could be the term reflection, which can be understood as looking in the mirror, seeing one's image come back, but also as looking inside oneself. Trying to think what an oral parallel would be, the echo is one suggestion, but the echo at the same time suggests another kind of temporality. The echo comes back at a slightly later point in time. Of course, we need language to make this kind of sense of music. That is, to make theoretical sense of music, to engage in an academic discourse on or about music. One could, on the other hand, point to other kinds of musical sense outside or besides language, as when dancing, and the feeling of dancing is meaningful in and of itself. Here, no translation is necessary. We just get into the music, move to the music and movement establish a meaningful entity. A slightly different meaningful engagement with music can be found in Salim Washington's brilliant article, The Avenging Angel of Creating Destruction, where he discusses Samuel Delany and Henry Dumas, but also a kind of music making embedded in spirituality, where bringing the spirit down is key to the successful performance. In this, the sounds become meaningful if or when the musicians and audience can feel the spirit, and this feeling may not be too different from what happened on a dance floor, although the context is clearly different. Music or sounds are not on the outside of these experiences. Neither is it possible to divide strictly between the music and the dance, or between the sounds and the spirit. They are, in important ways, one. And as such, music takes part in the movement, takes part in spirituality. In Washington's article, he relates this music making to what he terms, quote, the Afro-technological, unquote, a term I see as related to the triad of culture, technology, and things to come in the mentioned definitions of Afrofuturism. Here is another story to tell about technology, as well as a different use of technology. It is also related to the musical instrument as technologies in their own right. One of Washington's examples is the playing of the saxophone in Pentecostal and Baptist congregations and the use of music to establish a connection for the believer between the psyche or spiritual dimension of the congregation and their physical bodies. This he describes as a technology, a kind of spiritual technology, where the musical instrument and the sounds being played is valued related to whether such a connection, such a state of elevated existence take place. The musician then is not only playing the room, she or he is also contributing to a spiritual anointing, a kind of traveling out of the body, thus showing for the listeners a way to another level of reality. Such a way of thinking can, in my view, be translated into other domains of life, but discussing the relation between the spiritual and the physical and the meeting between these domains seems crucial to me, as this opens another dimension in the speculative. The academic discourse on music and sound, on the other hand, is slightly different and often seems to require a translation from the sonic domain to the verbal domain, trying to use language to say something about music, using language for music to become meaningful. As said above, music is already meaningful, and so it is not correct to say that the music becomes meaningful only after having been translated into language. But it is clear that music becomes meaningful in a different way when conversing about it. And it seems within much of the Afrofuturist discourse that this is the preferred way for music to become meaningful. That is, we translate music into words, frame it, so to speak, and thus it become a part of the Afrofuturist discourse. We can hear sounds and the music as taking part in an Afrofuturist world building or in the establishment of an Afrofuturist discourse. One of the authors I'm inspired by in this talk, however, is George Lewis, who asks what music can say or tell about the Afrofuture. And he explicitly delimits music from much of what could be seen as contextual to the music, what traditional musicology used to call, quote unquote, the extra musical, such as, for example, liner notes on an album, the costumes the musicians use when playing, and so on. As he writes, what does the sound, not dress, visual iconography, witty enigmas, or suggestive song titles, what can the sound tell us about the Afrofuture? I guess in a parenthesis, I could say this is the whole question of my talk here today. Lewis's question is imperative, and while it could be read as a dichotomy between sound on the one hand and everything else on the other, I prefer to read it as the intertwining of the two dimensions, but simultaneously as a reminder to keep the sound in focus. That is, discussing Afrofuturist sounds with a focus upon the sonic, letting the sonic have the upper hand, so to speak. In the same article, Lewis continues by focusing upon what he calls a, quote, triad of blackness, sound, and technology, thus showing how his understanding of Afrofuturism is slightly different than the definitions I've already quoted, because of this focus on sound. In addition to Lewis's talk on the sound of the Afrofuture, where there seems to be a downplay of the speculative fiction and rather a focus on sound and technology, there is another key inspiration for thinking about sound and the Afrofuture, Kodjo Eshun's coinage, quote, sonic fiction, unquote. Lewis actually mentions Eshun's concept and calls it extraordinarily powerful. And thus, these are not necessarily competing conceptualizations. Rather, they are, I would argue, different perspectives on the sounds of Afrofuturism. Eshun writes about sonic fiction in his book, More Brilliant Than the Sun, Adventures in Sonic Fiction from 1996, which is a book tracking primarily avant-garde-ish music of the Black tradition from Sun Ra to Detroit techno. It is an important book also as groundwork for establishing a way of thinking about what became known as Afrofuturist music. Sonic fictions are not only the sounds of the music, although the sonic is the entry point into the relation with the music. Rather, sonic fictions take the whole context of the music, the aesthetic package of the LP or CD with liner notes, picture material, and so on, as well as the live performances and philosophical or spiritual or political statements from the musicians into the discourse. The titles of both LPs and compositions are seen as integrated in the sonic fiction, and thus there is more to this music than meets the ears. In a sense, Esschen's book is the written equivalent of the movie The Last Angel of History from 1996, directed by John Comfra, a film where Eschen also partakes. The opening of The Last Angel of History tells the story about Robert Johnson, who at the crossroad in the Deep South was given a black secret technology known as the blues. Thus again, another story about technology and music, and from this black secret technology, other musical forms are developed from jazz to hip hop. Let us just watch that opening together.
We came across the story of a blues man from the 1930s, a guy called Robert Johnson. Now, the story goes that Robert Johnson sold his
Something happened.
soul to the devil at the crossroads in the Deep South. He sold his soul, and in return, he was given the secret of a black technology, a black secret technology that we know to be now as the blues. The blues begat jazz, the blues begat soul, the blues begat hip-hop, the blues begat R&B. Now, flash forward 200 years into the future. Next figure, another hoodlum, another bad boy scavenger poet figure. He's called a data thief. 200 years into the future, the data thief is told a story. If you can find the crossroads, a crossroads, this crossroads, if you can make an archaeological dig into this crossroads, you'll find fragments, techno-fossils, and if you can put those elements, those fragments together, you'll find the code. Crack that code, and you'll have the keys to your future. You've got one clue, and it's a phrase: mothership connection.
The mothership connection, it's kind of George Clinton's obvious, it's his 1974 album in which you have an alien, you have George Clinton who's like an alien in kind of silver foil, and he's kind of getting out of the spaceship. You can't work out whether he's getting out of the spaceship or getting back into the spaceship.
By this time, black itself had become commercial. You know, it was hip to be black, you know, to the music, you know, the dance bands of James Brown and all of that. So, and hip-hop, I mean, rock and roll had just like faded out, you know, in '69. So it was time to make a change.
Greg Tate is the writer who argued that black people, in America certainly, live the estrangement that science fiction writers kind of talk about. All the stories about alien abduction, all the stories about alien spaceships taking subjects from one planet and taking them to another, genetically transforming them. Greg is kind of recasting American history in the light of science fiction and saying, well, look, all those things that you read about alien abduction and genetic transformation, they already happened. How much more alien do you think it gets than slavery, than entire mass populations moved and genetically altered, entire status moved, forcibly dematerialized? It doesn't really get much more alien than that.
Sorry. Sorry, just my computer making strange stuff here. It's okay now. I will highly recommend the movie The Last Angel of History if you haven't seen it. I would call this movie a quote-unquote speculative documentary, knowingly that speculation and documentary seemingly are strange bedfellows. And the movie speaks into today's topic. Obviously, in a film essay like this movie, speculative as related to vision makes sense, and the film uses the visual and the juxtaposition of different layers or modes of vision to important results. The data thief, one of the key figures in the film, is also a time traveler, and thus the film can move between different layers of time, including an archaeological travel back in time from the future. In other words, both the past and the future is present in whatever here and now the film presents. The archaeological dimension also resembles how Eshon, in a later article called Further Consideration on Afrofuturism, frames by a theme of archaeologists from the future coming back to find traces of the past that can make historical sense for them. With these archaeologists from the future, our present is decentered. We get to see our present with eyes from the future, and thus as another layer of history. Thus, oral history and sonic fiction intersect as the present becomes a site for archaeological investigations. This at the same time gives us an opportunity to listen to our present differently, as fragments and fossils of sonic cultures. As already said, with the possibility of storing sound available to be replayed at a later time, we got access to the sounds of the recent past. There is a sonic archive available to us. Still, it would be a stretch to say that we have any direct archive access to the past. It is rather a mediated access. We can, through the sound technologies, listen to a past, and try to make sense of this past in the present. This past is one of several possible pasts, as it is dependent upon which sonic traces of the past are stored and which are not. This at the same time reminds us that the past is a multitude of possibilities, even if more often than not, we will at the same time have to admit that most of those possibilities are most likely lost forever. When we speak about the gramophone and the sonic archive, only sounds that were recorded can be played back. This is in a sense a very literal sign of how many sounds that were never recorded, and it gives us a sense of the magnitude of non-recorded pasts. With the archaeologists of the future in mind, however, and focusing on our contemporary situation, it also leads to questions about how we preserve the present for our future descendants. How do we store our present? How do we record the diversity of expressions found today so that future historians can recreate from their archive a relevant picture of the past? And while I do use picture here, I obviously also think about the future of my discipline and whatever musicologists, should they still exist, will study in the future. Live music, music played in the moment, is in a sense not meant to be stored, although obviously it is, both on albums, in movies, and today quite a bit for streaming. Recorded music still exists, although seem to be gradually moving onto streaming services where the archival dimension, again seen from the perspective of future generations of historians, musicologists, and so on, the archival dimension is different than in the archives of the gramophone, records, and CDs. The storage technologies, again, will need the technology to read and reproduce the music, whether it is in the grooves of the gramophone or the digital code of the CD or the streaming. It is not that I argue that we should try to store everything and give to future generations all the artistic products and expressions made today. but thinking about whatever pasts may be lost and how we preserve and reconstruct pasts through cultural work, we could also mirror that thought and make it be about our present and what we do for the future generations. Again, what about the sounds older than the invention of the gramophone? This is the same question, just seen from two different perspectives. Are they forever lost? I would say they are not, but the source material and how we are to deal with these sounds differ substantially from the sounds of old gramophone records. To go back to my opening, as a musicologist, the first source I would point to is written and notated music. In the European tradition, this goes back to the 9th century, although at that time, most of the elements of music were not notated. There is also a prehistory to this practice. The history of notation is fascinating in itself, but what does it tell us about how the past sounded? We can recreate the notated sounds, but then other sources come into play as well. One of them is musical instruments. While many of the musical instruments in play today are of more recent origin, there are historical developments of musical instruments that can be recreated as well. Learning how to play older music instruments then is another historical practice where the sounds of the past are given new life, so to speak, are recreated. And in combination with music notation, and given work done on what kind of musical practices the notation is a shorthand for, one can attempt to come as close as possible to how the past may have sounded. This cannot be any exact replica of the past, as we don't have any clear measure stick to use, but it is arguably as exact as it is possible to come. And it is one of the places where a historian of music could be said to speculate about the sounds. Playing old instruments and recreating past musical practices also brings the argument in a somewhat different direction. Learning to play music is about more than reading scores and recreating the sounds. It is also about bringing to life all the dimensions of music not found in the notation. This is a key reason for having a teacher who can learn you about history and not least about tradition. This kind of learning is not necessarily related to any use of verbal language. More often than not, it is about imitating, where the student imitates the teacher and where you get a kind of practical knowledge of music making. And more importantly, this is also how music is transmitted in so-called oral traditions. I'm saying the logic of oral transmission is kept in the written transmission as well. The transmission in an oral tradition may at first seem less stable than the transmission of scores or gramophones. As in the children's game, when one child whispers something to the next and where the content is distorted going the round of children, there is a suspicion that the content changes in an oral tradition, or that one cannot really know because the original is lost. But research in oral traditions show that there is a quite stable dimension in such transmissions and that different kinds of memory are at stake. The opposite of that argument is the so-called loss of memory in cultures depending on writing, where writing down whatever you were supposed to remember means that you don't necessarily need to have it in your memory because you have it in your notebook instead. Just like I used to remember phone numbers before I got a cell phone, and after I got a cell phone, I don't remember even a single phone number because they're all there on just with a button. The memory at stake in the transmission of stories and music throughout the ages is related both to mnemonics, to rhetorical strategies, but also to a bodily memory where musical practices are repeated. This repetition can be, and often seem to be, a pretty exact repetition, exact enough that it makes sense to see it as the same being repeated. And the small variations introduced in repetition thus brings us to what Amiri Baraka back in 1966 called the changing same. While Baraka's discussion of the changing same in a more narrow sense seems to be about similarities between what was in the 60s called the new thing in improvising music and its contemporary rhythm and blues. It is also a term of use for discussing historical continuities in Black music. As such, it resembles the opening of The Last Angel of History, where a Black secret technology known as the blues is given to Robert Johnson. And later transmitted down through history as a part of each new musical genre of Black music. Even this transmission from Robert Johnson to hip hop contains an element of speculation, as is clear in The Last Angel of History, but is still in accordance with much of how the history of Black music in America is written. From this story, however, some other implications can be extracted that may be said to belong more to the speculative domain. Here I am thinking about the history of Black music before Robert Johnson received the blues at the crossroad in a deep South, a history that goes back to West Africa and which is an important prehistory of the African-American condition. And on the other side, so to speak, there is a history of the future hinted at by the data thief in The Last Angel of History, but also found as an important feature of Afrofuturist music. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. That was insightful and truly interesting talk. I know that for a lot of our participants, the landscape that you've mapped out here in terms of ideological contingent is a complex one. And I really appreciate you taking the time to touch on these important sort of pivotal ideological spaces. So I want to see if we have some questions from our audience and see what we got here. So one question we have is, can we, when we're thinking about the study of music in Black culture in the past, how do you relate that to our contemporary musical landscape? Is it diverging? Is it continuing? What are the patterns that you see? I'm paraphrasing here. What are the patterns that you see in terms of Black sound production?
Yeah. I wanted in this talk to focus about some aspects from a musicological perspective about history, because I think that a lot of the music taking place today, not all of it, but a lot of music taking place today relates to musical pasts of different layers. The discourse on Afrofuturist music very often takes Sun Ra as a point of departure, and he's a reference in much both jazz and hip hop and samples, both aesthetically and musically. And I think with the practices of hip hop, it has become really clear how another version of the changing same that Baraka talked about in the 60s is internalized into music production. And I think that to do something musically new, you need to know the past. And I think that from that knowledge, from that copying, and from that copying for today, trying to make the past relevant today is one of the ways forward in music. So that would be my first half answer. The second half of that answer would be that this whole thing about trying to imagine how future music will sound is a really tricky question. I would have to play a lot of examples if I should do it. It's often done by electronic instruments. It's often done by synthesizers. It's done by using musical material to predict something that has not happened yet, but in the here and now, which is a fascinating topic in itself. But it's this back and forward between tradition, the past, and imagining the future, or sonic imagination. That was what I was hoping to get at in this talk.
Okay, I appreciate that. Another question we have from the chat has to do with, well, first let me say, part of the reason that you're our first speaker, of course, is that you're in Denmark and time zones. But you do allude to this at the beginning of your talk, and I'm assuming that this question is about this. As a person from a European background, as a white person studying Black music, what do you see as some of the challenges related to your framing of these subject matters and a kind of global diaspora that's increasingly looking for marginalized voices to move to the center?
Yeah, that's a question that obviously I think about all the time related to my work, because I don't want to be someone speaking on behalf of someone I'm not, and I don't want to be someone speaking in the place where someone else should have spoken. I am a white North European man, and that means that engaging with Black music is a place where I need to learn to listen. I need to be attentive. It's not always easy. I mean, I'm sure I do. I'm sure I'm failing in this from time to time, to sort of not do the academic career thing and rather do the conversation thing, because that's also part of how the university system works. But I could not have done what I do now without also trying to listen to stories about and around this music, trying to relate to voices that have been marginalized before. And it's also a difference between me now sitting in Copenhagen and in Florida at the same time, because for better or worse, as far as I know, there are no Black musicologists living in Scandinavia. So when I teach this music for my Danish students, I still think about the fact, and the students think about the fact, that we are outside of the community where this music appeared and lives on. But studying it helps us decentralizing our culture and our tradition, so we get a broader perspective on the relation between, well, European music, so-called classical music, popular music, white music, Black music. We sort of need to have our own perspective decentered, and I hope that I contribute that with my students, and that we get better ears and better knowledge about traditions, discourses, and practices that we didn't know about when we went to primary school and so on. But it's one of those problems that, one of those issues that is unsolvable in a way. I mean, you kindly asked me to speak here, and of course one possibility was to say, no, you shouldn't ask me, you should ask someone else that is more on the inside of the culture, and I would have understood that kind of decision. But I also was really happy to say yes and to participate, listen to the questions, and hopefully learn, and hopefully gradually become a a better human being.
Thank you for that answer. I think we have some questions from the audience, so I'm gonna pause here and see if Trent has something.
Yeah, we have one. Hi. My question, I was wondering, you talked a lot about technologies, and technology that kept popping up in my mind was the rise of technologies that have really democratized the production of music, especially electronic music, and the sharing of that music on SoundCloud and other. What do you think the role is? And I'm thinking of every iPhone now comes with GarageBand. You can sample old music, and that's something that's just much more accessible than it would have been in the past. And what do you think that has? What role do you think that has in this Afrofuturistic sound that you've been discussing?
Thank you for that question. I think, I mean, there's, as you say, there's a democratization dimension around it, easier access to technological production, manipulation, and storing of music. That's definitely one part. And I think we have just seen the beginning of that, while at the same time seeing how the whole musical ecology is changing with streaming, and whether it's SoundCloud or Bandcamp or whatever, where it's hard for musicians to earn money for it. So I also think that there's something happening about the role of being a musician is changing. I'm so old that I remember when we started streaming, one of the problems with the democratization was also the thought that we would have a unified global music culture. We would always only listen to mainstream pop music that was popular, and that at least has changed. I think if you're curious, if you want to find music from unknown musicians around the globe, it's become much more easy. So for me, as working with music, I get to listen to a lot more music. I get a lot more input that I can think about and discuss. And I notice the same with my students. On the production side, clearly there are possibilities that a lot of musicians that previously had difficulties either getting training or getting contracts or getting music out, they have that possibility now. They are still in a field where it's a lot of competition to get yourself known, but it will. I'm sure we will see a lot of changes in the near future about how there will be a huge part of musicians that are not in the most popular in the press and so on, but they have different kinds of underground or different kind of communities. And I'm sure this already exists within among musicians that would see themselves as related to Afrofuturism.
So there's another question from the chat here. And it says, Hurston documented the blues, children's game, jumping rope songs, work songs, things like that. What can you say about her speculation on sound by valuing these cultural production acts, right? Can you speak to that approach and the technology that she used at all in terms of like your research?
Let me see here if I can.
Oh, it's to me. Are you looking for the question?
Yeah, I was. Could you repeat it for me?
Sure. Hurston documented the blues, children's games, jump rope songs, etc. What can you say about her speculation on sound by valuing these cultural productivities?
Yeah, thank you. That's slightly outside of a field I really know that much about. So you will have to excuse that I cannot really be as reflected as I would like to be. But I think in hindsight we can see that studying musical forms that were not seen as art but are important musical practices didn't originated inside of musicology. It had to be done by other people, and anthropologists, folklorists are very often there. and it's about old hierarchies about high and low, and what is art and what is popular and what is important and what is not important. And luckily, it's a long time ago that those discussions were really the foundation of music education, although there's still traces of it. And to me, to me, it's really valuable to see. That was what I tried to do in one of those midsections, to see that music doesn't have to be beautiful in any traditional way to work. And if music is doing what it's supposed to do in the context, then it's successful. If dance music makes you dance, that's great. If dance music makes the audience stand and just listen and nod their head, there's something wrong there. If you have a lullaby, the point of a lullaby is for the kid to fall asleep. You can sing beautifully, that's fine. But if you don't sing traditionally beautiful and the kid fall asleep, it's doing its work. And I'm studying more and more into this kind of, what work is music supposed to do, and can it achieve that kind of goal? Can it do what it wants to do? And there, I think that you can open up to discuss a much bigger amount of musical genres and musical practices as becoming highly meaningful for the people engaged with the music. So in that sense, children's songs, what are children's songs doing? What are they supposed to do? How are they working? Super interesting questions. But perhaps in this space between music studies and anthropology.
Right. So I want to follow up on that in part because I think one of the things that you've alluded to in your talk, and I think is a persistent sort of question in Afrofuturism, is it's the nature of sound as a technology. And you just said, if the dance song doesn't make you dance, it's not necessarily working. I think one of the things that's really interesting in your talk is that you go back to The Last Angel of History, a classic documentary, docudrama. I struggle with how to describe that. I show that in class myself. In that film, I think it remains very, very important, in part because it puts at the center of any consideration of Afrofuturism that sound is a technology, and that Black hands creating that technology are transformative to culture. And this can be one way that we connect all sort of Black sounds together, right? That hip hop is Black hands creating like a new thing. So in that regard, is the tools being used crucial, or are the outcome being achieved crucial when you think about this intersection between sort of Afrofuturism and sound? Because there's a tension there, I think, in how we might choose to understand that process, right? Do you have, for instance, I think my students struggle with this when I teach this in class. They want to say, well, they have to use a certain kind of tool in order for it to be Afrofuturist. And I'm always like, no, I don't believe that. And I might be wrong, but I don't believe that. How do you come down on this tool versus?
Well, thank you. That's a brilliant question, and it's difficult, of course. I think I want to think about technology in several different layers. If I was to give a thorough answer, technology is about how we manipulate something, how we manipulate even our bodies. I mean, thinking about learning to sing as a kind of bodily technology that helps you to sing in the way you want to sing, whether it's be gospel or blues or opera. You need to train your body, and that kind of training is a kind of body technology. Then you have musical instruments, as I was saying. Musical instruments can be used in different ways, and those differences are also part of what I would like to call sonic communities. In different genres, you have the correct way to use a musical instrument, but you can use the same musical instrument differently in another genre. So you learn to speak the language of the community by the way that you manipulate your instrument. Then you have extensions of the instrument, which of course is one of the classical tropes in discussing both popular music in general and Afrofuturist music, like the electronics of Jimi Hendrix, for example, or the synthesizers of Sun Ra or Herbie Hancock, etc. Which continues, of course, to the turntable as a musical instrument in scratching, where you could say that's a misuse of a technology. You're using a technology for something it was not constructed to do, but it becomes somewhere between technology of reproduction and a technology of production, because you actually use it as a musical instrument. And then, as most musicians, I'm sure, will tell you, the instrument and the body of the musicians have a tendency to sort of melt together. You become one with the instrument as you learn to play. Thus, for example, playing a guitar or a saxophone is kind of similar to singing, in the sense that you have a bodily extension. I'm not saying you become a cyborg or anything, but you have a bodily extension that you use to express your own musicianship through an instrument together with the body. And that kind of interaction between bodies and technology would be yet another take to it. And I think that those are the different layers. And then comes what the data thief talks about as a secret black technology. And related to the earlier question we discussed, of course, I don't have access to the secret black technology. I can only think about it. But there suddenly technology becomes a kind of, I would say, spiritual technology, a kind of technology of feelings, of thoughts, of spirituality, of commonality, a kind of, this is what we share, either it's musically or historically or politically, that kind of technology of memory and expressing the feelings and thoughts of a community. And I think that's that secret technology of the blues that is hinted at in the beginning, that the blues become an impulse and a way of a narrative technology almost, but narration in music as a way to preserve and communicate crucial dimensions of being black in America in that movie's framing.
I really appreciate that answer. We have another question that was sent to me. Do you think your studies can be utilized as a decolonizing tool to not only, as you said, decentralize some aspects of European white culture, but also help Afro-European and anti-racist students decolonize spaces in academia, music, and beyond?
I think it can participate in that conversation. I think being hired at a European university where with strong traditions of a white European history and culture, I think that also white scholars engaging with material outside of that European canon contributes to at least questioning the canon, and also to sort of discuss how could it be differently. I'm not to be any spokesperson for the students' wish for a decolonizing, at least. I might myself be criticizing canonic formations in my discipline from inside the university, but I this is one of the places where I guess I should be I should be supportive. I should be an ally but it's not necessarily my fight, and it's super important for me not to think that it's me doing that fight, especially not on behalf of say Afro-Europeans or immigrants or all the others that are sort of boxed in the same category often here in Scandinavia, all quote unquote non-whites. I mean, I'm an ally. I hope those demands come. I hope those questions come. I think those questions are important, and I think that by showing that to a certain degree it is possible for a white Scandinavian to work with African American music, that is part of expanding the possibilities of the material we can study and discuss.
Thank you for that. I have another question. This is from the executive director of the PC, Nithari. She would like you to comment on how you hear how the traditional evolution of Black music sound will factor into our thinking about the future of music. And she's referring here to phenomena, say, innovation in jazz as represented by any of the jazz greats, right? You know, so this sort of generative element, which I think you alluded to a little bit, and you were talking about the blues and the sort of connections to cultural production.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a tough question. I think one place to hear it as in renegotiations between different layers of history. It's how a musician can combine music from the 20s, the 50s, and the 60s, and where that combination generates something. That is one of the things that I personally like a lot. The sort of thinking that even if, because a lot of musicians are thinking about to break into the new all the time, classical narrative of linearity and development, and I personally listen a lot to and for music that tries to do that, breaking into the future by referencing the past along the way. So that's one of the domains. The other, I would say, is related but not quite the same, and that is samplings and quotations, which are two different layers again of some kind of what I in my book try to discuss as sonic time travel, which is using historical material more abruptly into a different context. And then I think that, and this might be partly my own bias as a scholar, but I think that going back in history, finding musicians whose musical afterlife, musical descendants sort of disappeared. Music that didn't have a future is an important part, because perhaps they had a future still, but it's just waiting to be opened. I'm, for example, been writing a bit about Eddie Harris, who played electronic saxophone in the 60s. And the electronic saxophone is not really an instrument that had a lot of future, but there's something in that, what he is doing, that could be taken up and reinvented into a present and a future. So unfinished histories in the past would be one way to sort of think how those processes of developing can function. That's not quite an answer to the question, but it's the best I can do from the top of my head, I think.
That's a legitimate answer. I think one of the things that animates a lot of our conversation as we were thinking about, animates a lot of my conversations as I was thinking about this cycle, is this question of the real complexity represented by sound in Afrofuturism. And as you well know, there are lots of different pathways that we might take can you talk a little bit about where you see some of the future conversations related to Afrofuturism and sound from your perspective as a musicologist, and coming from a very particular position, I recognize, but still within that kind of dynamic landscape, where do you see some of the pathways that offer interest from scholars that you're engaged with and the field that you're situated in?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I have a few things. They are not quite related to my presentation, but I noticed when I was finishing my presentation as well that I have much more of a tendency of quoting or referencing the same canon of male musicians that a lot of writing on Afrofuturism too. And I think as male scholars, we need to get much better in listening to non-male voices, be them female or trans or gay queer voices. I mean, I noticed it and I said, okay, I'll go with this presentation anyway, and I hope I get a question where I can say this, because I have written. It's not only about male musicians that I write about, but there's a tendency in my work, and I need to work on that. But I also think we need to expand on the canon. There's a tendency that writing about music in an Afrofuturist context also have sort of established the canon now, and I think that there's good reasons for it. Firstly, it's great music, and it's also important music, but I think it's important to remember that one might actually take part in a canonization process, and do we really want to do that? Then I think a question that is going to follow us for quite some years going forward now is whether Afrofuturism is is a US thing, or whether it has another geography than being in the US. And if Afrofuturism is the Black diaspora in both the US and in all of the Americas and in Europe, and also related to musical practices on the African continent, then there is, I think, a huge necessity to also be able to discuss musical differences and similarities without really missing both of them. That said, both sort of keeping the US Black music tradition into the conversation, but also engaging with other musical traditions. And I'm actually in two minds about this. And I see scholars and writers also discussing whether Afrofuturism is in a sense so US based that one need other terms to discuss similar processes in other geographical areas. But I think both the diversity within music and musicians we discussed, that is important, and the discussion about geography, US versus other parts of the world. Those are conversations needed in the future.
I think that's a great place to sort of start our wrap up. I think this question of scope is one that we will return to. I do want to, again, thank you for your presentation. I think you provided a really strong framework here for us to think about Afrofuturism. And I do want to end reiterating this point you're making about, our goals here in terms of our discussions for the conference are about trying to understand the complexity here for people who want to know more. Are there particular works beyond your own that you would advocate, or sources that you would advocate that they seek out? They want to learn more about Afrofuturism. Are there books that you would recommend? I mean, you mentioned More Brilliant Than the Sun, which is a sort of classic work about Afrofuturism and sound. but are there more general for the public sort of avenues? Sounding Out is a sound blog, a blog of sound studies, which I think is a great resource for people, Sounding Out. But what would you say if people want to try to know more? Where would you send them?
You know, even as I am an academic, I would always say go to the music first. I would say listen to the albums. I would say spend hours listening to albums, reading liner notes on so much great music from before Sun Ra's first recordings, but that's a good place to start. And I think we need to, I was just criticizing the canon, but I think we need to listen to the canon, because I think the non-canonic is also in relation to it. So listen to the canon. I agree with you that Eshen's book is getting old, but it's still brilliant in many ways. Louis Desocquet's book, The Sound of Culture, is a book I always recommend. There are quite a few articles out there now. I have a search personally on one of the internet things that I always get emails notifications when books are written about Afrofuturism. There are a lot articles. There's a lot to do. I wish I could be more precise, but that's the best. If there's anyone in the audience that want to, feel free to write to me if there's any more specific literature you're looking for, and if I know of anything, I'll send answers to them. So that's the best I can do there.
That's a legitimate answer. I do want to say that for people who are interested, I did put together a kind of overview sound playlist that you can find online if you go to the ZORA Festival website. This was intended to be a kind of map of the sonic imagination that touches on many of the artists that Erik has talked about, people like Sun Ra, many of the artists that are part of that canon. This Janelle Monáe, you know, the artists that we often refer to in Afrofuturism. But as I say in my introduction to that playlist, that is always just the beginning. And as Erik is sort of laid out here, and as we will continue to talk about throughout the conference this next couple of days with our keynotes, we are taking the opportunity to give us glimpses of a very complicated landscape. We don't have, our conference would have to be several months long if we were hoping to try to cover everything. So instead, we're trying to provide some guideposts from great scholars like Erik that allows us to have these meaningful conversations. So I want to take a moment again to thank him for joining us from Copenhagen and braving the problems of Zoom and internet lag for a really insightful and engaging conversation. Again, thank you very much, Erik.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm going to turn this back over to Scot French, who is in Orlando, and I'm going to mute myself from Michigan. So it's an international cross time zone kind of situation right now.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Great start to our two-day conference. We're going to return at 1:30 today with Dr. Tanisha Taylor. Check the program and be sure to come back and join us for the afternoon. All right, see you soon. Thank you.